Hi everyone, for the hardy ones that were able to make it into the Zoom meeting. Welcome here. I'm Seth Seamus, and I am Managing Director at Eco Agriculture Partners, and I'm also a lead of the Finance Solutions Design Team of the 1,000 Landscapes for 1 Billion People initiative. And I would like to welcome you on behalf of the organizing group for this meeting, which includes Eco Agriculture and Climate Kick and Regenerative Development Group and Common Land and CDP and Rainforest Alliance and Well Labs. And a couple of housekeeping notes here. That it would be great if you could introduce yourself in the chat, say who you are. It could even better if you include the name of your organization with your name in your window. And you can type questions in the chat as we go along. There'll be some relevant resource material we'll share there as well as we go along with the introductory presentation. And then afterwards, after the presentations, we'll be going into breakout groups. So you can be prepared to share insights and thoughts there in smaller groups. And then after this meeting, we'll share a full report and results from the session, along with the other resources following the webinar. So it looks like people are starting to show up. That's good. So thanks, Shannon, for whatever you were doing to solve that. All right, so this webinar is a continuation of a program of webinars from the Finance Solutions Design Team of the 1,000 Landscapes for 1 Billion People initiative. There were a series of online dialogues on landscape finance over the course of this year that were fairly well received and stimulating to us and many of the participants. So we decided we wanted to continue this model with some deep dives on landscape finance mechanisms. And this is the kickoff of that series specifically on that topic. All right, so we can go to slide 2-1. So the primary purpose of this session is to identify the priorities of those of you who've come today for the topics for future webinars that are interesting to you, so we can begin to develop a learning agenda around them. And we're hoping that these discussions can help to build a community of practice around landscape finance mechanisms and to spur further development of this field. We're planning to have a couple more of these this year, and if all that goes well, potentially continue on into next year. Okay, next slide. So the way this is going to run is that I'm going to start by giving a framing for the discussion. And based on the registration for this event, I know that there are folks here that haven't been to any of our previous webinars and may be new to this material. So I'll quickly go through some foundational topics, like what do we mean by landscape, and what is the 1,000 Landscapes Initiative, and what is integrated landscape finance, and what are integrated landscape finance mechanisms. And then we'll have some short descriptions of potential topics around landscape finance mechanisms that could be subjects for future webinars to set the stage for some small group discussions. And those will be given by my colleague, Juan Ramos at Eco Agriculture Partners and Jean-Louis Ribaudet at Regenerative Development Group. Then we'll break you all into small groups where you can share your thoughts and priorities. And we'll use all these responses, including the responses to a poll that we're going to share after these presentations, to help set the agenda for the future work. Okay, so next slide. All right, so the central idea of our work at 1,000 Landscapes is that to shift a trajectory of degradation to one of regeneration requires moving beyond small, short-term, sectorally siloed projects to embrace of whole landscape strategies for development. And when we talk about landscapes, we mean large areas where people, nature, and economic activity interact over time. And a landscape may be defined as a watershed, a biological corridor, a jurisdiction, a food shed, an indigenous territory, and there are many other terms that describe this basic set of actors and process within a sort of spatially defined area. A landscape partnership, as we describe it, is a voluntary alliance of actors who manage or depend on the resources in that landscape to pursue a thriving future that benefits everyone. So why is it important to look at land or resource challenges through a landscape lens? Well, first, because ecological, social, and economic interactions among land uses and users in a landscape can have powerful negative and positive impacts. So these affect the viability, profitability, risks, and impacts of individual farms, businesses, projects, markets, and communities. So for example, invasive species in forests threaten both farm production and wild biodiversity. So second, coordinated landscape design and action can maximize synergies and minimize trade-offs to benefit business projects and communities. So for example, managing flood risks requires spatially aligned actions on farms, forests, and settlements. And finally, stakeholder alliances in a landscape can accelerate place-based solutions for regenerative transformation. For example, landscape partnerships can catalyze local markets that incentivize regenerative farming and jointly advocate for supportive policy. Okay, next slide. Now, the 1000 Landscapes Initiative, we refer to as a radical collaboration. It's more than 40 organizations around the world who are already engaging more than 250 landscapes to support these rapidly proliferating landscape partnerships. We frame our work around this 4 returns language, returns for human well-being, nature, regenerative economies, and inspiration. So that's what we're looking from the work. And the process of doing this includes tools of integrated landscape management, which are organized into these dimensions here in the slide. So strong local partnerships, developing shared understanding of what's going on in their landscapes, long-term visions and strategies, and also short-term action plans, and then aligned action and financing, and then also finally impact assessment and learning. Okay, next slide. So currently within 1000 Landscapes, we're in a design and testing phase, but we do know that moving to the future of a transformation strategy or a scaling strategy, we will be working to empower landscape partnerships to accelerate their operations and collaboratively implement action through access to locally adaptable digital tools on the Terrasso platform, ILM learning resources and services, national coalitions and networks, and support to mobilize financing through a landscape finance accelerator, which I'll mention more about in a moment. Second, we're going to foster an enabling environment for landscape partnerships by mobilizing allies in policy, business, research, as well as finance. And then finally, we hope to advance a collaborative landscape movement so that these approaches are widely embraced and are institutionalized in influential organizations. So finance is obviously an enormous piece of this puzzle. So next slide, Juan. So, and that's the topic of this series. So how does finance fit into this discourse around integrated landscape management? And what can we do about it together? So what do we mean by integrated landscape finance? So this is an approach, the way we talk about it is an approach and a set of tools for funding landscape scale transformation. We believe that looking at finance in this context introduces new ways of thinking about how different projects and enterprises can interact in ways that relate to profitability, risk, social and ecological conditions. So once a partnership has developed a vision, strategy, and an action plan, they can do an assessment to identify a set of their priority investments with identified types of financing. So this is where we see the development of what we refer to as a landscape investment portfolio, in which the financial needs of a set of priority investments are identified, and these investments would ideally be synergistic in some way. Some of the priority projects will already have clear business plans and cash flow models, and others will be newer and will need to be developed. Businesses and organizations will need to clearly identify their existing resources and additional financing needs. And ideally, this would include an understanding of the level of support required, as well as the type of financing instruments that are most appropriate. So the slide that's up here is a generic version of this that I'm not going to read out to you. But in our first finance dialogue earlier this year, we highlighted some real examples of these portfolios. And you can find these. We're going to put this in the chat. There's a link to some of the slide decks that were put together by real landscape partnerships that we're describing something like this, their landscape investment portfolios. So you can look through those, look through them now, or you can look through them afterwards. Okay, next slide. So integrated landscape finance mechanisms. So what makes these different? So that's the topic we're discussing. So what does that mean? Well, some of the businesses and the projects in the investment portfolio will be able to self-finance or access sources of finance that are well known to their developers, but others will benefit from new kinds of financing for multi-sector, multi-project alignment. And those are what we refer to as landscape finance mechanisms. These fund multiple activities across sectors with financial, environmental, and social synergies between the activities that are coordinated in space and time in support of landscape objectives. That's the sort of perfect, idealized description of what it is. Next slide. So, and we have found some examples of this. Maybe not always the fully, idealized version of it, but there are elements of this that are now popping up in around the world. So 1,000 Landscapes has done some work to learn about them, document these mechanisms, and try to describe them in an effort to support their development. We of course want to support the development, so landscape partnerships have sources of financing, and we have some resources we can share. The paper that's here was written in 2020 that laid some of the analytical foundations. I think that will be going to the chat shortly. Next slide. And then earlier this year, one of the finance dialogues focused specifically on landscape finance mechanisms, where we engaged directly with the people who'd been developing these to describe them, provide presentations on this. So that's another resource that was going to the chat, so you can see some slide decks. Because of course, there's not enough time in this very short session to go through these examples, but if you would like to, you can learn about them here. And this is just a description of the examples that we have that we can share with you. Okay, so next slide. All right, so I'll show just a couple of slides here to introduce the framework in which we see these mechanisms, and kind of some examples of types. First, we have the landscape finance mechanisms themselves. And these are the entities through which funds flow directly. So these include grant facilities, as well as mechanisms that contain a commercial component. So the grant facilities can allocate capital to strengthen landscape scale institutions and to build a pipeline of projects that are aligned with the visions and strategies of landscapes. For commercial investments, blended finance instruments can utilize public and philanthropic resources to attract for-profit investment, and these can take a number of forms within a landscape context. We'll hear more about them from Juan and John Louis in a moment. There's landscape-specific investment funds we've seen. An example of this could be like a landscape-focused water fund, building off the model that some of you might be familiar with, the TNC, Nature Conservancy, has pioneered and works a lot on. The Landscape Resilience Fund, the Dutch Fund for Climate Development, are both funds that work around the world, not just in one landscape, but in multiple landscapes that use something like this approach. And there are landscape bonds, and I'll probably hear a bit more about this in a moment, but there's a case where we are working with in the Landscape Finance Accelerator in Mount Mulanje, Malawi, with the Mount Mulanje Conservation Trust that is under exploration right now of a landscape bond model, and work is being supported by the Regenerative Development Group and the Sustainable Finance Coalition. Another model is a landscape development finance institution. We've seen some of this in the United States, actually. There's an example called the Cascadia Foodshed Finance Project, which worked with a community development finance institution to direct loans to a sustainable food system investments, or a coordinated effort for sustainable food systems in a particular region. And again, there's more resources on that example in the resources that we shared in the chat. Okay, next slide. Okay, so types of aggregators, project developers, and brokers. So these mechanisms don't just exist on their own. There are a variety of specific sort of landscape finance types of support services that are required to do these things. and the variety of ways that these roles are played. So in some cases, landscape partnership take on these aggregator or project developer type roles themselves when there's no one else there to do it. But when the partnerships often don't have these kinds of capacities. So when they aren't playing the roles themselves, even if they play some of them, there can be these external service providers that support them. These could be nonprofits or for-profit entities. There is a small cohort of like NGOs and consultants that have begun to take on some of these roles out of necessity, but there are very few groups that have specialized expertise working on finance issues in an integrated landscape context. So this is a major barrier that we found. We also have these accelerators and incubators that are beginning to pop up, which are working to build the capacities of the partnerships, but potentially also the investors. And this is an area actually where the 1,000 Landscapes Finance Accelerator is working. This is an effort to develop tools and approaches that can be used by partnerships or external specialists to facilitate landscape finance while supporting individual landscapes. All right, so now next slide. We're switching presenter at the moment. So we're going to go a bit deeper now. So there are a few topics that the organizing team has identified that we think could be very interesting for future webinars. So we're going to present these briefly, and then in small groups, we'd like you to respond to them or bring up any other ideas that you would like to work on. And for this, I'd like to pass over to my colleague, Juan Ramos.
So yeah, I'll quickly go through the first four kind of topics that we've presented kind of as framing here, and Jean-Louis from the Regenerative Development Group will do the next four. And the idea here is basically to provide some sort of introduction to what these topics are, and kind of a bit of a framing for you to get an idea of what they could be and whether you would like to explore those in future learning webinars together. So starting off is the one on strategies for financially supporting landscape partnerships. So this could take a variety of forms. Currently, there are certain grant facilities or coordination funding that is provided to partnerships for enabling activities. In particular, this also not only includes kind of like the grant or coordination funds for philanthropy, but also thinking about the business and operating models of the landscape partnerships themselves. So basically, how can landscape partnerships be set up so they can receive and manage funds? Because this is also one of like the key difficulties for sustainably having these kind of governance structures, which are multi-stakeholder partnerships. We see these strategies as being really important because, of course, partnerships and governance, these kind of governance structures need finance and funding to successfully coordinate locally agreed upon actions and provide a negotiating space for land use across stakeholders. So we basically see these governance structures as really important because they connect this top-down and bottom-up approaches, which we see as an essential red thread to ensure that actions can be coherent over time and ensure that they're not canceling each other out or duplicating themselves, kind of as Seth described earlier, kind of trying to maximize synergies and minimize trade-offs. So one well-established example of this in terms of the grant facility is kind of the Legacy Landscapes Fund, which Seth mentioned in the map of mechanisms that have already been documented. And it basically provides long-term grant funding to partnerships and landscapes for these essential enabling functions. So the idea, in this topic would be to explore different models, including endowment funds, conservation trust funds, and think about how they're developed, what are their potential, what are the opportunities, but also what are the risks, and also look at what landscape partnerships look at in terms of business and operating models for how they consistently access and manage financial flows. Now, on the second one, an overview of finance entry points for landscape partnerships is basically thinking about, there's very different land use and entry points for why there are supporters or funders or investors in landscapes. And these really range from restoration to biodiversity conservation to food systems, climate change mitigation and adaptation approaches, and many variations in between these. However, this topic would look at how do you really connect the complexity of all these entry points to support these governance structures and landscape partnerships and their objectives. So the kind of the question to explore would be, how can these different entry points be connected or combined through integrated strategies and mechanisms that support local needs? So a quick example of that would be something like a jurisdictional approach. We've seen one that's fairly advanced in the Department of San Martin, Peru, which developed a low emissions rural development strategy, which combines all of those components as a policy document by the regional government. And it connects really from national level to local level policy on food systems, infrastructure, livelihood, biodiversity, and a zero deforestation strategy, coming up with an investment plan that combines different financial flows to really look at how all of those different objectives can be combined, and it's managed kind of through an investment plan through the regional government office. The third would be kind of thinking about carbon finance and payment for ecosystem services for landscape scale action. So basically, I'm sure everyone's heard of carbon finance or payment for ecosystem services in some way, but basically these are mechanisms for financial flows to go from a payer who's looking for some impact on carbon or biodiversity or water, and the payer is basically paying in exchange for some result. So these payments are certified or validated through different technical methodologies or protocols. And these are supported by a wide variety of actors. However, there are controversies to these, and there are difficulties in quantifying values and market intermediation, which in some cases really significantly reduces the amount of funds that really go to the ground and stay a bit with the landscape developers as a whole. So, thinking about how these mechanisms for financial flows to go from buyers to payers, from payers to the ones who are developing projects on the ground, and how that can support landscape scale action, not only for specific projects, but how to structure these funds or credits in a way that they can have greater impact across the landscape. And there are certain kind of emerging models of subnational and jurisdictional carbon crediting systems that are emerging. This includes something like in Mexico, there's a lot of subnational schemes that are coming up, such as in the state of Querétaro, where there's a lot of locally led action being provided for financial incentives for carbon mitigation, which are aligned to locally led plans and actions. There's also something known as the LEAF Coalition, which is this public-private partnership that it convenes large amounts of money from corporates and from donor governments to subnational governments to basically directly pay for results. And there's a lot of organizations really exploring how can we make these systems and these financial flows really get to the ground more effectively and more efficiently, and how to structure that in a way that that can really support landscape scale action. And really quickly on the last one is the idea of really exploring how to be more consistent on language. There's a lot of misunderstanding generally between landscape practitioners, partnerships, and governance structures when they're looking to get funds. So how can you use language more effectively and consistently to assume that to make sure that really that interaction is much more effective? There tends to be a lot of assumptions that are unchecked in how something is expected from an investor, or even from a landscape partnership from the investor perspective. So how can we create a bit of that space so that we can reduce that miscommunication as much as possible? We can have a common language that's more effective, and ensuring that technical definitions are used correctly, particularly with financial stakeholders, and particularly on mechanisms, really making sure that that's something that's clear. An example of what this could look like is co-developing some sort of a resource like the glossaries developed by the Consumer Financial Protection Bureaus or agencies to make sure that consumers understand what they're really getting into, and what the terms really mean. So let me hand over now to Jean-Louis so that he can talk through the last four.
Yeah, thank you so much. Hello, everybody. It's nice to see so many of you and some friends in our sector. My name is Jean-Louis Robert with the Regenerative Development Group, and we partner. We're a technical partner on 1,000 landscapes involved in landscape finance and the accelerator specifically. Really great to be here. So for the final four, and maybe let me zoom out for a second. I think one thing that we really emphasize within 1,000 landscapes is that we start from the landscape. And I want to reinforce that point because as we talk about finance mechanisms, it's very easy to get lost in technicalities, right, of finance and the incredible complexity of finance. And we're just now surfacing a few of these opportunities. The focus really is on how can this mechanism advance landscape goals. And what that means is the goals of landscape actors. And landscape actors include people, communities, often the most underserved in our economies and in our systems. So I emphasize that because it's easy, to come from a different perspective, which is a little more top down, and think about, okay, I've got a mechanism, who needs it, how can I deploy it? And within 1000 Landscape, we really do the opposite, right? Which is to start from the landscape, from the needs of the landscape as defined by the partners, the landscape partners, and then move up into finance mechanisms. And I say that because the next four are a very good example, all of them are very good examples of types of mechanisms and finance strategies that have amazing potential to support landscape transitions, but currently it's fair to say are mostly not connected to landscape goals. And work is being done to ensure that that's done more intentionally, but we're not there yet. But they do have a lot of potential. So quickly going through those, transition finance via development banks. So we all know that the next 25 years, the world needs to undergo a massive transition. Call it, the green economy, call it the climate economy, the net zero economy, whatever you want to call it, or nature positive economy. That needs to happen, and it will have to happen over the next quarter century. So transition finance is emerging really as a codified approach whereby especially development finance institutions, think about the International Finance Corporation, think about the Inter-American Development Bank, and many others. There are hundreds of DFIs around the world, right? So these are just two well-known examples, are really aligning their investment strategies with the transition needs of whom? Well, of countries, right, under their commitments, such as their climate commitments, their nationally determined commitments, the global biodiversity framework commitments, and many others. Or it can be corporates, right? Large corporates and DFIs typically, especially the large ones, will primarily support large corporate actors in their transition. So how can these transition financing strategies, many of whom support countries, entire countries, and are connected to debt relief and are connected to credits and how credit worthy a country can be in their transition. So how can we align these often global strategies with landscape action? So that's a very important inquiry for us as we seek to connect local action with global systems. The second one, or the sixth one on this slide, is a really critical one, and we see it as a really critical tool across the board, and one that in our mind is really designed to bridge what we call the valley of death of many of these investment opportunities. So what is this valley of death? This valley of death is that critical portion of the development pathway where you go from an idea to an incubated project, something that may have potential to develop, including commercially, but isn't quite ready yet. And on the other side of that valley of death, you have large-scale financiers, increasingly pension funds, institutional investors waiting for the deals, right? And increasingly making commitments to invest their monies in this transition, right? And in all the projects that can manifest this transition. The in-between is the absolutely critical moment where many projects go to die, right? And within landscapes, and we've seen many, many examples of that, beautiful projects, amazing projects that never quite take off, never quite accelerate. So this notion of catalytic capital, preparation investments. There are many, many terms to describe that. And it can come from government, it can come from institutional organizations, it can come from philanthropy, it can come in the form of grants, right? Purely grants, where there is no expectation of return. It can come in the form of patient capital. These are all potential ways in which this catalytic financing can help to bridge this valley of death. And so it's really part of the system transformation that is needed. So it's a very important tool in that system transformation. And then we have these very large scale investment mechanisms, right, that we all hear about, right? And they can be bonds, green bonds, water bonds. They can be part of debt for nature swaps, for instance, or any such very large mechanism that is looking for investable opportunities. And here what we mean by investable is that they have to generate some kind of return. Maybe not as individual projects, but as part of a portfolio of projects. These have significant potential. And as Seth or Juan mentioned before, we are, for instance, exploring the feasibility of such mechanism in the context of work we're doing in Mount Mulanje, in the Mount Mulanje Biosphere Reserve with partners such as the Mount Mulanje Conservation Trust in Malawi, we're at a very early stage of feasibility assessment of that. And that is raising all sorts of really interesting questions as to what it will take to stand up a bond mechanism potentially in the context of a landscape. And then the last one, what an interesting one. So understanding landscape scale investments by corporates and credibility of claims. So this is a very complex sentence, but what is it getting at? Well, it's getting at some of the things that many of you, all of us probably are seeing pop up, which is these corporates, first of all, making these massive claims, right? And net zero being the big one right now, right? Which is being challenged. Many of you probably have seen what's happening in the EU, what happened in the EU last week, where they're becoming more and more stringent on those claims, right? And on companies being held accountable and liable for greenwashing. So that's the claims part. And then the investment part is to say, okay, if you're making that claim, what are you actually investing in that supports that claim? And investments, when we think about a corporate, can be a purchase, right? As in carbon credits, which is really buying. It's not investing in a traditional sense. They're really buying, and often buying because they're being penalized, so they have to offset their emissions. Or it can actually be an investment, right? For instance, when a large corporate would invest in a cooperative or in a large-scale farm operation in emerging markets or other markets, and then claim that that is contributing to reducing their emissions, for instance. So how can we, as landscape practitioners, connect with those broader patterns, ensure that they're done with integrity, and present to these corporates and others projects that are of high quality and that genuinely can support the claims that these corporates are making? So that's our last topic that we've surfaced as something that could potentially be examined in the context of this learning journey. So I'll leave it at that, and I think back to you, Juan. Or Seth.
Yeah, thanks, Jean-Louis. So very quickly, just to let everyone know kind of the methodology for deciding on next steps is really having to co-create the learning agenda. We'll have the breakout groups to get your feedback directly, get your thoughts, ideally get them kind of written in a Google document. And additionally, we're going to have a poll right now just to have kind of a prioritization by everyone that's here. So we can get an idea of the feeling of the group and direct reaction to what me and Jean-Louis just said.
Well, thank you all really so much for coming. And we really do hope to stay in touch and we're going to put together a report on this, share the results of the polls and the notes that we have. And very quickly, I think we're going to try to do another one of these just in a few weeks, so we'll get back to you, probably next week, once we've able to process all this. But again, thank you so much. And hopefully this is, this is the start of something. And yeah, so we'll be in touch soon and have a really good day.